Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. I'm Stephen Ansa-Addo, your host for this season, and I am thrilled that you can join us today, wherever you're joining us from. Today's guest is Pat Bennett. Welcome, Pat. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm doing good. Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this.
Thank you so much. Pat is a writer, a scholar, and a liturgist who's worked at the intersection of humanities and sciences, fostering conversation, exploration, and an exchange of ideas. So you've got a background in both science and theology. I think you've
Yeah.
worked for over 6 years with the Spirituality of Conflict project, writing introductions and reflections on lectionary Sunday gospel readings. So we're grateful to have you here with us today. You've also preached live on BBC Radio 4 for International Women's Day from St. Mary's Episcopal Cathedral in Glasgow. And you are also the editor of book What Were You Arguing About Along the Way? You're also a member of the Iona Community.
Yeah.
And you work developing programs with them and resources to help people explore both faith and activism. So we're really excited to have you here today. Some things that I hear that you enjoy, and you can confirm whether this is true or not. I hear that you love singing, you love
That's very
writing,
true.
you
Yeah.
love poetry, and best of all, you love whiskey.
Oh, well, I do love all of those things, and which one I love best really depends on what kind of mood I'm in.
And we're gonna have a brilliant conversation today. Joining us from J Pit today is Alex Claire Young, the campaigns and church engagement officer. Hello, Alex.
Hello. I could also go for the whiskey. Not right now, maybe.
Yeah. Right now, we're going to come straight back to you, Pam. We're going to ask you, does politics belong in the pulpit? It's a question that we ask all our guests here, but what do you think? Does politics belong in the pulpit?
Well, I think I'm obviously going to answer yes to that. But when I was thinking about how would I answer this question, I thought that actually it's very helpful to think as well about what do we actually mean by politics? Because often we get stuck on party politics. And generally, when politicians say things like the church shouldn't interfere in matters, it's because somebody has spoken out about something which might be seen as a party political thing. So I think some Christians would be uncomfortable with saying Christianity is political and the Bible is political. But I think if we think about politics in its kind of wider sense about it's about how we order society. It's about how we order and manage the relationships between individuals, between groups. I think if you looked at it in a traditional sense, you would say it's about how we distribute resources, and that's certainly been true since the Second World War, with taxes and the welfare state. But I think also recently it's become much more evident that politics is also about identity and about culture. And I think we're seeing that a lot at the moment particularly with some of the discourse around refugees, with these rallies we've had of reclaiming the flag and uniting the kingdom. It's also increasingly evident that it's very much about narratives as well, and how we control certain narratives. And I think we can see all of those things going on at the moment in the world we live in. But we see all of those things as well in the Bible, because primarily it's a text which is both recording and evolving understanding of what it is to have a good society, to live well, to have a society where people flourish. But also, when we get to the New Testament, very explicit teachings about the kingdom of God and about the importance of a full and flourishing life for people, and bringing about the conditions in which that can happen, about inclusion, about giving people their worth, and so on. So I would say, of course, politics belongs in the pulpit because the Bible is inherently a political text. And we, as people who are involved in the work of building the kingdom of God, that means we're inherently, that's political work in its biggest, its proper sense. So yeah, my answer is yes, absolutely.
At the time of recording, we're going to get some context on the news headlines as they are today. The UK has formally accepted the state of Palestine alongside Canada and Australia. I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about that, perhaps during our conversation. There's been a row between Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana within the Your Party. Over 70 people were killed by a drone strike on a mosque in Sudan on Friday just gone. The England women's team are through to the Rugby World Cup final on Saturday against Canada, and hopefully they win and bring it home. It's party conference season. Labour from the 20th of September, they're holding their party conference, and the Conservatives are from the 5th of October. The lectionary readings for this Sunday we're talking about the 5th of October, which is the 17th Sunday after Pentecost in Year C. It's still the season of Creation Tide. It's the end of Fair Trade Fortnight, and it's also Homelessness Sunday. So I'm sure that will feed into our Bible readings as well. Also, bear in mind, it's Black History Month in October, and I'm sure some of you will be leading Harvest Festival services up and down the country and around the world. And if you are holding communion, I lead communion on the first Sunday of the month and on the third Sunday of the month. It's World Communion Sunday on the 5th of October. The lectionary readings for this particular Sunday are Lamentations chapter 1, verses 1 to 6, Psalm 137, 2 Timothy first chapter, verses 1 to 14, and lastly, the gospel reading for this Sunday is Luke chapter 17, 5 to 10. So with all of that in mind, we're going to dive deep into the Bible readings that we have here. And Pat, the first question is to you. Is there a passage that you'd like to pick, either to preach from or to write about, or a theme that you've picked up across the lectionary readings?
I'm not preaching this Sunday on that particular Sunday as it happens, but if I were, I would definitely preach mainly from the gospel reading, but also bring in elements from the reading in the epistle as well, which is where Paul's talking to Timothy about nurturing the gifts he has. And the reason I'd go with those is I think because they, and again, harking back to what we just said about politics, I think that certainly in the gospel reading, particularly once we dig into it, there's something there which is really important way of understanding the idea of faith, particularly in the context of how are we to act in the world. So I think that's where I would go to start off.
Well, let's begin. Let's begin there with the gospel reading with Luke.
Okay.
Faith as a mustard seed. What's God saying to you through this reading today?
Well, I think it's a really interesting and a really important reading. And on the face of it, it's quite tricky when you first look at it. I mean, you've got these rather problematic metaphors, and then you've got these two statements of Jesus, one of which is rather daunting. If you had faith of this size, you could tell this sycamore tree. And then there's the one that sounds rather dismissive. They're just unworthy servants. Why are you expecting any praise? So on first reading, it's quite tricky. But I think that actually when we dig into it, it tells us something very important about faith. And it's something which I think Luke has been unfolding across the whole of his gospel narrative. So when we look at this, I think the other thing that's really useful to note here is lectionary doesn't help us because it misses off the first bit of the chapter. And when you look at it, that whole bit from verse 1, that's all one pericope, it's all one thought unit. So when we hear it in the gospel, it sounds like the question, it sounds like the disciples' plea, increase our faith, just comes out of nowhere. But in fact, it's coming in response to what's just gone before, where Jesus, they have been asking about forgiveness, and Jesus is saying, well, you have to keep on forgiving. And they're a bit kind of like, ugh! And that's the context in which they're saying, how can we possibly do that? And I think that when you start from there, I think when you look at what Jesus says, I think that what he's doing is showing them that faith is not about quantity. Because he says, this little bit of faith, you could do this. But it's really about sufficiency. He's telling them, you already have enough faith for what you're being asked to do. And we know that they've already experienced that, because when Jesus sends them out earlier in the gospel, he sends out the 77, and he says, don't take any extra things, don't take a purse, don't take another cloak, you just go. And then when they come back, they're like, but this happened and this happened and this happened. So it's something they already know, but they've kind of forgotten. And I think that that's a really helpful thing for all of us as people trying to act in the world, to remember faith isn't a kind of abstract thing that we have to have a certain quantity of. It's more a responsive thing. How do we act and live in the world in a way that's faithful to what we already know? So I think he's telling the disciples, you already have enough. And then I think that makes sense of the following bit, because he's saying you don't have to go after the spectacular. You just do what's been put in front of you in the ordinary hand of your life, in the small things. If you're a servant, you serve, and that's what you do. So I think for me, that's a really encouraging thing, because sometimes faith, and particularly this passage, if you have the faith as small as a mustard seed, can be used like a bit of a stick to beat you. Like if you had more faith, you could do big things, better things. But actually, I think what Jesus is saying here is, whatever God has tasked you with in this moment of your life, you have sufficient.
That's a really interesting point about contentment in a culture and society that we live in. You've reminded us that Jesus is actually challenging our culture, even still to this day, a culture that celebrates big wins and power.
Yeah.
How does tiny faith make a difference in all of that? I want to bring you in, Alex. Maybe you can answer that, or you can move us on to somewhere else within this passage. But what does tiny faithfulness look like?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's really helpful, particularly in the context of the work that JPIT does on working with people with lived experience of injustice. Because as you mentioned, Stephen, it's Homelessness Sunday, and Pat, I know you've had a look at the resources as well from Housing Justice, and a lot of what you said there really lines up with what they're saying about listening to the voices of people with lived experience of homelessness, which is something that I've experienced myself. And in their resources and lived experience of homelessness, they talk about vulnerable people being the best preachers of the gospel in their own communities. And they say, here's the mystery of the kingdom. When we plant seeds, God makes them grow. One conversation can lead to hope. One meal can lead to community. One act of courage can ripple far beyond what we see. So maybe the question for us today isn't, do I have enough faith? Maybe it's, what will I do with the faith I already have? So again, you've got this sense of there is enough. Whatever you have is enough, even if it's this tiny kernel of almost doubt, like barely faith at all, it's still enough. But there is that challenge to do something with it. So I feel like, Pat, you started with the challenging edge, and I think like that challenging edge is there. And if we only used the reading to tell us we had enough, we wouldn't maybe realize that the reading is also challenging us to use that bit that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Alex. And I think if you look, so all the way through Luke's gospel, he gives us stories about people where either faith or lack of faith is either implicit or it's explicitly referenced by Jesus. And in all of those things, you see people beginning with what they have and where they are and the situation that they're in, and reaching out in different ways. So sometimes it's with persistence. So you think about the people who brought their friend to Jesus. They maybe act with bravery in the face of hostility. So you've got the story of the blind beggar who shouts out to Jesus, even when the crowd is kind of saying, shut up, stop it. But he acts on what he feels. You're right, Alex, we have to act with what we have and what we know and believe that that will be enough. And it's going to look different for all of us.
Yes.
So we can't all do massive things. I mean, I think a really good example of this is, it wasn't what you one of the things we've referenced in our news headlines from this week, but just only a week ago, we're seeing lots of pictures of people being arrested for non-violent protest. They're simply holding up signs saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action, which the government has decreed to be, an illegal thing to do. And lots of people are being arrested. But that's not something that everybody can do. To be arrested has particular consequences. It's interesting to see that a lot of those people, not by any means all of them, but there are lots of people who are retired, elderly, people who are willing to risk arrest. But that's not for everybody. But we may still feel, I have to speak out in some way. But that could be anything. It might be that we would make a donation to support an organisation that's working in a situation of genocide or war. It might be that we would challenge somebody, a neighbour or a friend, if they say something and we think that's not quite right. It might be we support in other ways. It might be that we think I can go and protest in a way which puts me at danger of arrest because I think it's important to speak out. But for each of us, it will be different at any particular time of our lives. But the important thing is that we act in accordance with what we're capable of and also of where our understanding is in that particular issue.
I think that's a fantastic reminder for me of a sermon that really impacted me when I was younger. It took the word responsibility and cut it in half. So responding in your ability. And I think that's what you've both spoken to today about. There's a call to action here, isn't there? That's what I think you mentioned, Alex, a call to action there about being faithfully persistent, even planting seeds that we might not see the results of in our lives. And that's what you spoke to, Bennett, just having the courage to pursue justice, even if it costs you something. And I'm reminded there about, Bonhoeffer's cost of discipleship. It will cost us something. And for some people, it's arrest. For others, it's, seeing justice in their lifetime, which is a cost in and of itself.
And I think you said something key there, Stephen, which was about planting seeds that we might not see the result of, because I think there's a particularly kind of toxic habit that we have, in particular in Britain, I think, of thinking of product as being the most important thing. And it really goes over into ministry, into activism, into searching for justice, that we think, if I can't get to the end product that I want, I'm not even going to bother starting. Whereas actually it's the starting that matters. So there's so many things in the headlines today that look massive. We can't imagine, how are we going to end, the racist violence that's going on in the UK at the moment? How are we going to end some of the culture wars that are going on? How are we going to bring peace to Gaza? The fact that we don't know how we can get to the end often makes us not start. And I think this story shows us the power of starting.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great, I don't know if you know it, but there's a great song by the American singer-songwriter Sai Khan. So he's also an activist. It's quite an old song now. I think what you do with what you've got. And it has a fabulous chorus, which is, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. It's not how large your share is, it's how much you can share. It's not the fights you dream of, but the ones you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. And I love that sense of we have to be faithful with what we have and do something with that. And it doesn't matter. That might be something small, important thing to do. But I do think there's another element as well, which you kind of touched on in something you said, Alex. And that I think is where the epistle reading can also help, because Paul's writing to Timothy and he recalls his sincere faith, and then he exhorts him to rekindle that. And I think some versions, it's a bit more poetic. It says, fan into flame the gift that you've been given. And I mean, I lived for many years in a house which was only heated by fires, wood burning stoves. And so if any of you have ever lit fires or had stoves, you'll know that sometimes you come and there's just a glowing ember and you can bring the fire back, but you don't do that by just chucking loads of wood on. You have to breathe on it to give it some oxygen, give it some energy, and then you would add a little something and the flame would come up and start to glow, and then eventually you can put the logs on and you have the warming fire. And I think that that's very much also speaks to this passage. So yeah, we have to start with what we've got and where we are, but we also have a responsibility to try and at least give that the opportunity to grow and develop our understanding and perhaps how we can act. So maybe over the course of our life, it will change. And I mean, I think if you look, somebody like Nicodemus would be a great example of that. We meet Nicodemus 3 times in John's Gospel, don't we? And so you see that kind of change over time as presumably as his own understanding has grown, as his own faith has begun to develop. He's able to take a more and more public stance and a more and more risky stance in what he does. And I think that that's a great example really for all of us.
That's a fantastic, you've stirred something in me listening to you speak there, because I was really drawn to the 4th verse of 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 4. It says, recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. And for me, what really struck me there was when you said fanning the flame of faith. Grounding it in our context today, how do we fan the flame of faith in a time when trust in institutions, both political and religious, is really declining? I recall a time when things weren't not like this. How do we navigate this time? What do we say? What do we do?
Yeah, I think that's true, isn't it? I think there's been a real degradation in the quality of our public discourse, and also, sadly, sometimes faith-based discourse. And so you're right, it's hard. It's very easy to feel overwhelmed and to feel that there isn't anything that we can rely on. And I think I'm always encouraged when I come back to the gospel, and particularly to, like, if you look at something like Luke has a great narrative trajectory, and there's so many examples where you see people act in a faithful way and things change for them or for the society they're part of. And I think that is what we can hold on to, that we don't have to, as you said, Alex, we don't have to produce the ultimate solution ourselves. We have to be faithful in doing our little bit, even in the face of what seems to be a hopeless decay in public life, in having people we can look up to or whatever. The key thing is we remain faithful. We see the faithfulness of other people, and all those little things add up to something that's much bigger and will get us to these tipping points where things do change.
I also think in the epistle, there's just something interesting here in how Paul talks about suffering. And it's really difficult to talk about this well, I think, in preaching, because we can end up glorifying suffering. We can end up saying that people are suffering for a reason or that suffering is good. And I don't think any of that is helpful. But I think what is interesting is that Paul there's something about the attitude here with which Paul speaks that I find interesting, because in that whole kind of degradation of discourse thing that we've got going on at the moment, there's a lot of them versus us.
Yes.
There's a lot of speaking out of a desire to be right or speaking out of a perceived strength. Paul kind of repeatedly points to not speaking out of his strength, but speaking out of his vulnerability. And I just wonder if there's something here about refusing to get drawn into the kind of culture wars, I guess, of our time, refusing to pick this side or that, and actually saying, talking about human beings as sides is a problem, and flattening power structures is a problem. And, you know, actually being able to say, well, here I am, and this is how it is for me. And here this person is, and this is how it is for them. Just being able to speak to truths of experience rather than kind of Paul doesn't try to say this is the truth. He says this is my truth.
That in itself is a courageous act. Today, I would say in 2025, that is a courageous act to speak the truth of love and to hold that tension in disagreement, in discourse. I think it's so needed in the world in which we live in today, and a courageous act in doing it. So that's what I was going to say. Apologies, Pat. Please go ahead.
Oh, no. And I think I would absolutely agree with that. And so in that sense, it is countercultural, isn't it? Because the prevailing culture is to say, here's the truth, and to categorize, to make these statements, to have the whole fake news way of putting everything down and saying, we claim the truth for ourselves. So to actually say, we have to listen to people's lived experience and accept that as valid. And sometimes that's not easy. Because we would all tend to think of good examples of that. But, it does also mean we have to listen to some of the things which we maybe don't find so easy to hear, and to think, how can I then enter into conversation with this person, which isn't based on somehow by force establishing my point of view over theirs, even if I think their point of view is completely wrong. So I think there's a lot for us all to learn there in terms of how do we listen to each other, and having confidence in your sense of your own identity so that you're not needing to impose it on someone else. Because if your own head is full of noise, you just can't listen to anyone else. So it's, how do we build conversations or help people to make spaces in which voices can be heard, and in which we don't have to say, in this space, this is the truth, this is the narrative, but to say, I could hold a space where you can tell me how it is for you, and then that's a place we can begin with a conversation, rather than saying, I'm going to beat you with this big stick because I know what's true. Whack, whack, whack. And you're right, Alex. I mean, it just doesn't get us anywhere.
I often say that, the Bible won't tell you what Snapchat filter to use, but the things of life, we can really have a discourse richly. You talked there, Pat, about holding space for one another, which is really important. And I think Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept, where we remembered Zion. I was going to sing it, but I hadn't cleared my throat properly. So I'll do that next time. But I think there's something there about holding space for lament. You mentioned that, we might not like what we're hearing. And again, that's an opportunity to hold space for one another, to remember things that have affected us deeply. What do you feel about that psalm in particular?
I think what you say is very important, and it's a really difficult psalm. I think particularly how it ends. It ends with a terrible curse.
Yes.
Really, and that is shocking to hear. But I think you can. And while you say, well, there's no moral justification for that kind of action, but I think you can understand what's triggered that extremity of feeling. So this is a psalm that's written after the ravaging of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, isn't it? And they've been taken into exile. The city's been destroyed. And So this is coming from a people who have witnessed destruction, displacement, massacre, looting. I mean, these things, this is an event from long ago, but we would all recognize this kind of thing because it's going on in the world today in various places. There are wars around the globe, there are genocidal wars, there are territorial wars, there are religious wars. And however we choose to label those, what's happening is that at someone somewhere, people are experiencing as individuals and as societies the destruction of their homes, of their culture, of their livelihoods, of their education systems, whatever it is. And you can understand how that gives rise to these very extreme feelings. And we have to make a space for hearing that and holding it.
I think it's the least that we can do to help displaced people as they recall these tragedies, these horrors, as they recall their homelands in a place of exile, to let them hold space and speak in their mother tongues, to encourage one another, to be encouraged, to just sit and listen while they weep and remember. I think, thinking about things such as the drone strike, they really help us to visualize what's really happening in our world today. Alex, I want to bring you in a little bit here. How do you feel about this psalm in particular? Is anything that stood out to you?
I mean, I think there's something in this psalm about how we talk about violence, and that sometimes we can say things in prayers that we can't say in other places. And I think there's something different about naming a desire to do something horrific in a psalm, in a prayer, than doing it. But I just wonder about the role of prayer in the world that we're living in today, because some prayer is different in tone than some of what's going on, and then the kind of quite binary way of thinking that people are speaking in. And in Psalms, including in this one, there are hints of trust and faith, and there are mustard seeds in the violence. And I just wonder if Psalms kind of tell us a way to communicate in a different way. And I'm thinking as I say that about the prayer for peace that we released last week
Yes.
about Israel and Palestine, and I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs of it that I think say some things that maybe need to be said. God of stones that shout and of people too often silent, we cry out in frustration as leaders posture and prevaricate. Lord, may hearts soften and meaningful dialogue begin. God of stones that shout and of people too often silent, we cry out in recognition of our complicity in violence and oppression. Lord, in your kingdom, no one would profit from war or occupation. And the refrain that repeats throughout that psalm is, as we cry out for justice, we commit to being people of peace. So again, it's kind of a linking of what we say and what we do. Um, and I wonder, even in Psalm 137, you have this violence that you really hope isn't actualized, although we know it is around the world. But you also have people who want to sing songs of who they are and to tell stories and to know where they can hang their harps. And I wonder what it might be if some of that was actualized. Where do we find home in the Psalms? And what does that mean for people in Palestine today, or for refugees who are trying to make a new home in the UK today? I just wonder if the psalm speaks a little to that, but to some of the anger that you can end up experiencing when you don't know where you can hang your harp.
I think that's right, Alex, absolutely. And I think that would also make us think about how we can make those holding places where these kind of very different feelings can be expressed safely, because they do have to come out in some way. I think when there has been so much destruction or violence or whatever, it cannot just be squashed. And what we desperately want not to happen is for that to come out in another cycle of violence and destruction, which involves the next generation of people. So I think, we have to be thinking very seriously about ways in which we can be part of that process of helping that not to happen. I think there's also like we haven't talked about the Lamentations reading, but I think in a different kind of way there, amidst those 5 Lamentations in that book, there's also signs of hope in a just future happening, isn't there? I mean, we don't see it in the reading today, which was just from the first one. And again, there are these powerful images of destruction, this kind of panorama of horror, this feeling of desolation in the wake of this specific disaster, which we can see this happening around the world today as well, exactly the same kind of things, the same kind of responses. But in Lamentations, there's also faith in the prospect of a restored order, isn't there? I mean, we know like that bits in them as 3, isn't it? 3, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. There's affirmations of God's goodness despite catastrophe. And so perhaps that's also part of what we've talked about in connection with the gospel reading, is ourselves always holding on to that hope that better outcomes are possible, and it's our responsibility to uphold those, to speak them, to work toward them, and not to lose heart. Because I think in the current circumstances, it's so easy to feel despair. Even for us, we're in comfortable situations, probably. The 3 of us, we will have our own different struggles with different things, but by and large, we're not having bombs dropped on our heads or whatever. But it's still easy to despair and to think we're just on a downward spiral, nothing will change. I think the gospel gives us hope. It should give us hope that is not the inevitable outcome, and that when we are, each of us, I guess, in whatever religious tradition we're in, faithful to what we know about building a world where people can flourish, about a commitment to justice, a commitment to peace. And if we're each of us faithful to that vision and work in whatever ways we can towards it, and not despair, whatever little I have, if it's used, it will become part of something greater, and that something greater will be the building of a different kind of world at some stage in which we can all flourish.
I love that. A world where we can all flourish. That's the justice that we long for, that we pray for, and we trust that God hears the cry of each of our hearts. Alex, Pat, is there anything else that you are burning to say about the readings that we've shared today? Anything that you haven't said that you'd love to say before we round off our conversation?
I'm going to go first mainly because I want to give Pat the last word. And I want to say something about mustard,
Oh, yes.
which is that it's really interesting that he chooses a mustard seed because Jesus is speaking during an occupation, and mustard is a really powerful plant. And in particular, in kind of Greco-Roman times, there's a lot of evidence of mustard being used as a poultice.
Oh,
So it's used to heal wounds, and it's
Yeah.
used in kind of war situations where people need something immediate that they can reach. But it's also an aggravator. So it's been used in weapons. And it is also something that just doesn't stop growing. It's a bit invasive.
Yeah.
So I think mustard is quite an interesting thing to talk about being grown in the context of an occupation. And I just wonder if Jesus is being a little bit rebellious here. Um, and maybe we need to cling on to a bit of that as well, that these small seeds, they don't just grow into something big, they grow into something useful, um, and something that can heal. And I think maybe that matters.
I think if I were going to end with anything, I'd probably just go back to the words of the song I quoted, because I do think that it says it very eloquently. And to just say to each of us, just be encouraged to be faithful in the small things wherever you are. It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. It's not how large your share is, it's how much you can share. It's not the fights you dreamed of, it's those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Thank you for listening, and I hope this episode helps you in your preaching prep. Thank you to Pat, and thank you to Alex for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast, and please share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media. But till next time, see you soon. God bless.